This is lecture 9.3, the third lecture for week 9 in HOS 121. And in this lecture, we'll talk more about risk-taking and delinquency in the adolescent years. So first, is adolescence typically a time of turbulence? So G. Stanley Hall, who was a major formative figure in the field of psychology, coined the term storm and stress to describe the adolescent years. And he wrote 2 volumes about adolescence, and he really started the field of sort of looking at adolescent development. And he characterized adolescence as a time of moodiness, frequent conflict with parents, and risky behaviors. And that's been a kind of ongoing debate for human development. Is there such a thing as storm and stress? Is adolescence a time of storm and stress? Storm and stress he got from the German Sturmendrang. So is it that? And it's a kind of ongoing debate. So your book describes it as sort of being just dismissing it and saying it's a myth. And it's certainly true that not everyone will have such a stormy period, and not all cultures do you see such kind of drama in terms of the adolescent years. But there is something to it as well, because we certainly do see certainly more risk-taking behaviors during adolescence, and the relationship with parents tends to be generally positive, and you feel good about their parents, but there is more conflict, and there is more moodiness as well, and part of that has to do with a lot of brain development and the physical changes of puberty. So I included an article in the You Want to Learn More that talks more about the idea of storm and stress, but it's an ongoing debate, but it has a lot to do with the cultural context, certainly. So, and it has a lot to do with individual variation. So you'll see it more in some children, young people, than others. But one thing there's no question about is that adolescence is an exciting time in terms of human development. A lot of things are happening in the adolescent years. There's increased independence that's going on, and youth are getting more autonomy from their families. They're having closer relationships and placing more importance on peers. They're beginning to form sort of sexual relationships and romantic relationships and becoming aware of their sexuality. And they're forming their identity, as we talked about in the first lecture. And they're going through some major changes in terms of their physiology, in terms of their bodies, and in terms of their cognitive ability in their brains. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's a time of enormous change, both physically and socially. So do adolescents engage in more risky behaviors? So it's been an interesting question for researchers to look at, because if researchers do what researchers tend to do, which is ask people in surveys or bring them into a lab, if you ask adolescents about what they should do in a particular situation, they'll often respond like adults, because they know what they're supposed to do. But actually, the kind of self-report in terms of data collection often fails to capture certain dynamics around adolescent risk-taking, because adolescents tend to take risks within the context of groups, so when they're around other peers, and when they are emotionally aroused, so when they're really excited to be around their peers. So if you ask them in a lab, what should you do in this scenario, they may say something quite rational, but then you put them out in the real world and they will engage in more risky behaviors. So it's pretty clear that adolescents are uniquely vulnerable to risk-taking. They tend to be more novelty and sensation-seeking after the period of puberty, and they don't have fully developed emotional self-regulation yet, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that. And they don't yet know really the consequences. They don't fully think through them. Even if they know them, they don't fully, their brains aren't kind of wired to think through them fully. And so this can really be observed in group behavior. So risk-taking is often a group behavior in adolescence. Delinquency, which we'll talk about, alcohol consumption, and risky driving are all more likely to occur when teens are with their peers than when they're alone. And part of the reason has to do with their brains. So the adolescent brain is going through a time of great change. Yes, people who sort of study the brain talk about this as being a time of brain remodeling, because actually a lot of the connections that have been formed in the brain during childhood become pruned, meaning that they get cleared away and the brain gets kind of restructured. And the connections with the prefrontal cortex, which is the area of the brain which controls impulses and the ability to plan ahead and to understand the consequences of our behavior, becomes better attached. More connections are made with the prefrontal cortex during adolescence, but they're not fully there yet. So really, the brain is really in an intense period of development until about age 25. So young people are not yet sort of very good at controlling their impulses or regulating their emotions or thinking through the consequences of their decisions in the adolescent period, which leaves them more vulnerable in terms of taking risks. And there's some typical ways of thinking for adolescents that also contribute to risk-taking. So your reading talks about these. There's a way that adolescents are egocentric in their thinking. They think a lot about the self and about themselves. And one example of that is the imaginary audience. So the idea that the self is the center of the universe, that others are paying attention to you, they're looking at you, they see that spot on your shirt, they are thinking about your behavior. This idea that others are preoccupied with what you are doing is sort of a characteristic of the way that teenagers think. And so teenagers, young people, adolescents may act in a particular way to reinforce the way that they want to be seen. So they may act in a way that is sort of risky and seems cool to kind of impress others because they think others are paying close attention to what they do. So again, it's a way of thinking that can reinforce a tendency towards risk-taking. Another influence on risk-taking is a couple of other typical ways of thinking are the personal fable, the idea that no one in history has ever experienced this thing that I'm experiencing. That it's unique to oneself. An adolescent often will think that. And then also the illusion of invulnerability. Again, this may not be sort of technically an adolescent will know that they're not invulnerable, but there's a sense that nothing can happen, to me. And if it does, I can handle it. So that can, again, the sense that a person is special and can be immune to harm in some way can, again, make them take on risks and think that they won't be affected. So the reading, for example, talks about taking risks in terms of not using protection during sex, thinking, oh, I'll never get pregnant, which is, I'm sure, something many teenagers who've gotten pregnant have thought. So again, a way of thinking, an egocentric kind of way of thinking about the self, about invulnerability that can relate to risk-taking. And just finally, I wanted to talk about delinquency in adolescence as connecting to this idea of risk-taking and also connecting to maybe the interests of folks who are thinking about criminology. How can we understand criminal activity that begins in adolescence? So there's some antisocial behavior that just happens during adolescence. It's those kind of minor things like shoplifting, like what are called status offenses, where you're breaking curfew, or drinking underage, but they're just illegal because of your age. Being truant from school, for example. That's not a law that applies to an adult, but it applies to young people. So breaking rules like that, for example, versus the kind of persistent antisocial behavior that begins in the adolescent period but continues on throughout the life course. So those are two very different things. It's very typical to be involved in minor criminal acts during adolescence, and typically they fade and not many people persist. But some small percentage of people, about 5% of youth, will engage in antisocial behaviors at an early age, and that will continue throughout life. So for example, you might see a kind of a more aggressive child in early childhood at age 4 or 5, hitting other kids, then shoplifting at age 12, and then stealing cars at age 16, and then, selling drugs at age 5. So, what contributes to that kind of life course antisocial behavior? So there's different things. Again, there's the dynamic of nature and nurture. Biology contributes. It seems from twin studies that there's more similarity among identical twins compared to fraternal twins in terms of physical aggression. And biology is also related in terms of temperament. So having certain aspects of temperament where someone's overly emotional, so being really moody, or inattentive, or having poor emotional regulation also can contribute to antisocial behavior. And then there are social risk factors that relate to things like parenting, harsh discipline, poor monitoring by parents of their children, high marital conflict, poverty. And these types of risk factors tend to build on each other. So when young people have multiple risk factors, as we talked about in week 2, that's where you're more likely to see the negative outcome, in this case, delinquency in adolescence, when a young person not only grows up in poverty, but also has poor parenting, let's say the uninvolved form of parenting where there's low monitoring and low warmth, low control of the child. That can, connect with school problems, and then there's conduct problems, and then that may set up a dynamic in the relationship with the family where there's less parental monitoring and more distance in the relationship, and then forming more close ties with peers who are deviant and aggressive. So it's when those accumulations of risk factors start to form at different points in the lifespan where you're more likely to see delinquent behavior that persists beyond adolescence into the adult years. So we'll leave it there for adolescence, a time of excitement, and for some, a time of storm and risky behaviors leading into becoming a fully fledged adult.